The whistle cut through the air at 2:32 p.m. on a Tuesday in August. Sharp, short, the kind that meant business. And 43 people inside Combat Readiness Center Building 7 snapped their attention toward the door. She was 2 minutes late. Ivy Calloway stepped into the training room the way someone steps into a place they already know is going to be difficult. Not hesitant, but careful. Her white medical uniform still carried a faint rust-colored stain along the left sleeve from a 12-hour overnight shift in the trauma wing. Her hair was pulled into a bun that had been tight at 6 a.m. and had since surrendered to gravity. The skin beneath her eyes was the color of bruised sky, the particular shade that comes not from one bad night, but from a sequence of them. She was 34 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she weighed 128 pounds on a good day. The room registered her the way rooms register something small and easy to dismiss, quickly and without ceremony. A few heads turned, a few looked away. One person in the back row leaned over to the man beside him and said something low enough to not carry across the room, but his shoulders shook with it. Sergeant Major Carter Aldridge stood at the front with a clipboard in one hand and the particular expression of a man who had been running mandatory training sessions for 11 years and had long since made peace with the fact that nobody wanted to be there. He scanned the room, marked something on his sheet, and his gaze landed on Ivy without warmth or hostility. Just acknowledgement. "Calloway, you're with Boyce." The name landed in the room before Ivy had even found her place. And Mason Boyce, standing near the center of the training floor, with his arms loose at his sides and a smile already forming at the corners of his mouth. Heard it the way a person hears an unexpected gift. He was 21 years old and built like someone had assembled him specifically for the purpose of taking up space. 6 feet and a half inch of structured muscle, a black belt in Muay Thai he had earned by 17, and the easy, occupying confidence of a young man who had been told he was exceptional so often that he had stopped questioning it. He was 3 months from his Special Forces candidacy evaluation. Everyone in the room knew it. He made sure of that. He turned to face Ivy as she crossed the floor toward him, and he spread his arms slightly, not wide, just enough, in the universal gesture of a performance beginning. "Well," he said loud enough, "looks like we got a medical professional joining us today." A few people laughed. Not everyone, maybe 15, maybe 18, but enough to establish the room's temperature. Connor Blake, standing at Mason's left shoulder, pulled out his phone with the particular urgency of someone who recognizes content worth capturing. Ivy stopped at the edge of the tatami. She did not look at Mason with anger. She did not look at him with fear. She looked at him the way you look at weather, observing, categorizing, deciding what it means for you specifically. Then she did something small that nobody noticed. She reached into her right side pocket and removed her pair of latex medical gloves, the thin blue ones she'd been wearing since a dressing change at 0900, and she folded them in half along the seam before tucking them into her left pocket. It was a precise movement. Not a nervous fidget, not a distracted gesture. The fold was exact, deliberate, the kind that becomes automatic only after hundreds of repetitions in environments where items get stowed and retrieved in the dark. She placed her feet shoulder-width apart and waited. Hazel Drummond, 26 years old and 3 months into her posting as a junior medical tech, was standing 2 people to Ivy's right. She had worked alongside Ivy for all 3 of those months and had never once heard her supervisor raise her voice, complain about a shift, or talk about her life before Fort Bragg. She leaned slightly toward Ivy now, keeping her voice beneath the ambient noise of the room. "I can ask to swap. I'll say I need a different pairing for size." Ivy shook her head. Once. Clean. She didn't look at Hazel when she did it. Hazel pressed her lips together and stayed where she was. Sergeant Major Aldridge called the room to attention and ran through the standard orientation for the mandatory combatives refresher. The purpose, the safety protocols, the hierarchy of techniques to be practiced. His voice was flat and practiced, the voice of a man reciting something he could deliver in his sleep. Around the room, 43 people stood in varying postures of compliance. Some straight, some slouched, some with the patient stillness of people who had done this before, and some with the restless energy of people who had not. Ivy stood straight, hands loose at her sides. She was not looking at Aldridge. She was looking at the room, a long, slow, continuous scan that started at the door she had entered through, moved across the mirrored wall on the east side, noted the secondary exit at the northwest corner, tracked the arrangement of equipment racks, and settled finally, briefly, on the gap between the window frame and the far storage unit, approximately 31 inches, before her gaze returned to neutral. The whole movement took 4 seconds. Nobody saw it. Before we go further, if you've ever been dismissed before you even had a chance to prove yourself, this story is for you. Ivy Calloway has been invisible at Fort Bragg for 3 years. Everyone walked past her. No one asked questions. But today, something shifts. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment. What's the first thing you noticed about Ivy that felt off? We'll read the best answers below. Aldridge called the pairs to begin. Mason bounced on the balls of his feet twice. A warm-up habit, a ritual. The kind of movement that says, I have done this 1,000 times, and I will do it 1,000 more. And then he looked at Ivy with the particular expression of a person deciding how much restraint to apply. Relax, nurse girl, he said. I'll take it easy. He turned to Connor Blake and mimed pressing an invisible syringe into his forearm. Connor nearly doubled over. Noah Kimball, standing 2 rows back, laughed through his nose. Ryan Archer, broad-shouldered and quiet in the way that some people are quiet while still managing to take up considerable space, moved 2 steps to the left without being asked. The movement was casual, architectural. He was positioning himself. Ivy watched Mason. She did not watch Connor. She did not watch Ryan. She watched Mason the way you watch a clock. Not because it's interesting, but because it tells you something. Mason stepped in. He led with a jab combination, kept it controlled, the kind of sequence you use to establish distance and rhythm. Ivy moved to his right at a 45-degree angle, not backward, to the side and slightly forward, slipping outside his lead hand in a way that put her at his flank. The movement was small. That's it. It was also not in any civilian martial arts curriculum that Mason Boyce had ever studied. He didn't register what he had seen. He registered that she had moved, and he followed. Connor Blake's phone was up. She's running, he announced to no one in particular, and to everyone. Nurse girl is running. This produced laughter from the corners of the room. From the back row, Bradley Norris, 47 years old, Fallujah 2004, currently serving in an administrative oversight role at the base, lowered his eyes from his phone screen for the first time since the session began. He looked at the floor. He looked at Ivy. He said nothing, but he did not look away. Liam Foster, the combat instruction specialist assigned to assist with the session, stepped closer to Aldridge and said something low enough that only Aldridge could hear it. Aldridge's response was minimal, a brief headshake, a return of his attention to the clipboard. Mason pressed forward, closing distance. He pushed the pace, layering in a low kick that caught Ivy on the outside of her left thigh. She absorbed it, redistributed her weight, and circled. Clean, no drama, no visible reaction. Mason's smile widened. He turned to face the room briefly, a small performance, a check of his audience. And that was when he raised his voice enough to carry. Somebody want to tell me why we're required to train with people who've never thrown a punch in their lives? A few people laughed. A few didn't. Hazel Drummond had stopped laughing approximately 4 exchanges ago, watching the floor with the expression of someone working out a math problem they don't like the answer to. The laughter did something to the temperature of the room, though. It organized the bystanders into a shape. It gave them a role to play, and most of them stepped into it the way people step into roles when they're offered, without much deliberation. Ivy was back in the center of the floor. Mason moved in close, grabbed the front of her collar with his left hand, a control grip, standard, used to set up strikes, and Ivy's right hand came up to the inside of his wrist. The movement was so fast, it wasn't visible to most people in the room. What was visible was the result. Mason's grip broke. His elbow torqued outward at an angle that made the joint protest, and for exactly 1.5 seconds, Mason Boyce was standing in a position he had not chosen. Then Ivy released. Clean, complete, no follow-through. Mason stumbled 1 step back. He looked at his wrist. He looked at Ivy. He looked at his wrist again. The room had not caught it. The room was still making noise, but Liam Foster had caught it. He was standing 12 feet away, and he had gone very still. Pause, Foster said, not loud, but with a quality of authority that brought the session to a halt. He crossed the floor toward Ivy. He was 42, had trained in combatives through 3 branches of the military over a career that spanned 20 years, and he walked with the specific gait of a person who has spent a significant portion of his life moving through environments where posture and pace signal intent before words do. He stopped in front of Ivy and said, low enough, "Where did you train?" Ivy looked at him, not at the floor, not past him, directly at him. This isn't the time for that. Foster held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he stepped back and said nothing. Mason, who had recovered and was watching this exchange with a new quality of attention, turned to Connor and said something under his breath. Connor glanced at Ivy and resumed recording. "All right," Mason said, louder now. "Let's try something different." He beckoned to Ivy from the center of the tatami. "Come on, show everybody something. You've got moves, right? Teach the class." Noah Kimball started a slow clap from the back row. Ryan Archer joined with a light rhythmic tap of his shoe against the floor. The sound organized itself into something that resembled encouragement, but was structured like a cage. Ivy did not move to the center. Mason shrugged, rolled his neck, and launched into a demonstration. A complex Muay Thai combination, sharp and precise, executed with the fluency of genuine skill. He was good. There was no denying it. Whatever else he was in that room, in that moment, the technique was real and earned and displayed with the confidence of someone who had put years into the body. He finished and held his arms out toward Ivy. Ivy had been watching the combination. She turned slightly to Hazel, her voice below the ambient noise of the room, quiet enough that it shouldn't have carried more than a few feet. He overextends the elbow on the third strike. In a real situation, that's where it ends. Hazel stared at her. Liam Foster, who had moved to a position 6 feet to Ivy's left while Mason was performing, turned his head. His jaw was tight. He said nothing, but his eyes moved from Ivy to Mason and back with the evaluating quality of a professional recalibrating his assessment of something. Mason was in the middle of another remark to the crowd, something about nurses and combat readiness, something that got the reliable laugh it was designed to get. When Ryan Archer, positioned at the edge of the mat, let a water bottle roll off the equipment rack behind Ivy. It hit the edge of the tatami with a crack and spilled across the left corner of the floor where Ivy had been standing half a second before. Ivy was no longer standing there. She was 6 inches to the right, weight balanced, and she had not looked down at the floor when she moved. She had not broken eye contact with Mason. The room didn't notice the movement. The room noticed the water bottle and produced a few snickers at the spectacle of the mess. Ryan Archer raised his hands in a gesture of innocent accident. Bradley Norris, in the back of the room, had put his phone in his pocket. He was on his feet now, standing with his arms crossed, watching Ivy with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he keeps getting the same unexpected answer to. Aldridge, at the periphery of his attention, was moving toward the equipment-mounted terminal on the east wall, a workstation used during training reviews. He was typing something, slowly, with 2 fingers, and then the door to the south corridor opened. The man who walked in was 41, medium height, wearing a medical staff polo that identified him as Samuel Ezra, combat medicine, recently transferred from Naval Medical Center Portsmouth. He scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who has spent time in spaces where information needs to be gathered quickly. He found Ivy across 40 feet of training floor. His body stopped moving for 1 complete second. Then he continued walking, angled toward the far corner of the room, near the northwest exit, and stood there, with his arms loose at his sides, looking at the floor. Anyone watching would have said he looked like a man waiting for a bus. Anyone watching closely enough would have noticed that he had not taken his eyes off the training floor, since he found a position from which to watch it. Mason had moved back to center and was preparing to close the distance again when he pivoted and pointed directly at Ivy. "Here's the thing," he said, voice pitched to Carrie. "We all had to be here. Fine. But there's a difference between someone who serves on the medical side and someone who belongs in a combative session. No offense. Different skill set, different purpose." He looked at the room, collecting agreement. Right? A number of people nodded. A number of people said nothing. Daisy Chen, 23, standing in the 3rd row and small enough that she spent most training sessions adjusting her position so she could see, did not nod and did not say nothing. She said quietly but clearly, "That's not really a fair." "I appreciate the input," Connor Blake said pleasantly, from 3 feet away. "But nobody asked." Daisy's mouth closed. She shifted her weight. She looked at Ivy. Ivy had not moved. She was standing in the same position she had occupied for the last 40 seconds. Feet shoulder width, hands loose, spine exactly vertical. Her face carried no particular expression. What it carried instead was a quality of stillness that existed somewhere between patience and something else. something that didn't have a clean name in civilian vocabulary, but which people who had spent time in particular circumstances would have recognized immediately. Mason crossed the floor toward her in 3 strides. He reached out, grabbed the front of her collar, and this time pulled her forward. Not a practice grip, a real one, the kind that puts a person off balance. "Come on," he said, dropping his voice to something less performed and more direct. "Show me something real." Ivy's left foot moved back, stabilizing. Her right hand came to the inside of his arm, not to break the grip this time, but as a response. Automatic, immediate, the beginning of a neutralizing sequence. She arrested the movement, stopped it with visible effort, the way you stop a word that's already halfway out. Mason felt the resistance. He felt the specific quality of it. Not the resistance of someone fighting the grip out of panic, not the resistance of someone applying learned technique, but the resistance of someone suppressing an already completed decision. He released her, 1 step back. His expression had shifted in a way he probably wasn't aware of. "You have training," he said. "Not a question, exactly." Ivy looked at him with that same flat, calculating steadiness. And then she said something, low and direct, that only Mason could hear. "Last time I warn you." Mason stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to Connor and manufactured a laugh. "She watches a lot of YouTube," he announced. The laugh came back from the expected corners, but Mason didn't immediately step forward again. Liam Foster moved to Aldridge and said low, "The movement patterns don't match her file." Aldridge looked up. "What do you mean? She's not reacting like someone with civilian training. She's reacting like someone with something else." Aldridge held his gaze for a moment, then turned to the terminal. His 2-finger typing resumed with more purpose. Connor Blake had found the Wi-Fi and pulled up the Fort Bragg staff directory. He read from his phone in a voice designed to be heard. Ohio State University nursing major, graduated 2016. Employment record, 3 years Fort Bragg medical staff. He held the phone up. No combat training, no military background. Just, he shrugged, nursing. Aldridge looked at the screen, looked at Ivy, nodded once. Mason's confidence, which had bent slightly in the last 2 minutes, straightened back out. "See?" he said. "I'm not wrong. I'm just accurate." Ivy said nothing. Samuel Ezra, in the northwest corner, had stopped looking at the training floor. He was looking at his phone. He was searching for something, and the expression on his face had developed a very specific quality. The quality of a person who is confirming a thing they were already fairly certain of and finding the confirmation more significant than they had prepared for. He stepped out of the room through the northwest exit, quietly, without announcement. The door closed behind him. Nobody noticed. The session moved through its second half with the accumulated weight of everything that had already happened pressing on it. The formal combatives component had wrapped. Now it was structured sparring. Pairs working through preset sequences under Aldridge's supervision, with Foster circling the room to correct positioning. Ryan Archer made his second move 8 minutes in. He had repositioned himself during the break and was now at the periphery of the active floor, close enough to influence movement patterns, without being obviously involved. When Mason pressed Ivy toward the east side of the mat during an exchange, Ryan stepped forward on the pretense of adjusting his footing, and his elbow, controlled, directed, caught Ivy in the shoulder, the left shoulder. The sound Ivy made was so small that only 2 people in the room heard it. Hazel Drummond, who was close, and Bradley Norris, who had been watching with the complete, unmoving attention that some veterans develop in contexts where they have learned that watching carefully costs nothing, and missing things costs a great deal. Ivy did not fall. She turned the movement of impact into a step, her left foot finding the floor with absolute precision, her weight redistributing in a manner that had nothing accidental in it. She was upright in less than half a second, left arm slightly dropped, the small pain absorbed, and filed and not displayed. Bradley Norris uncrossed his arms. Foster had seen it too. He started across the room. But Mason was already closing. He read the slight drop in Ivy's left arm, the way a skilled fighter reads physical data, and he moved toward it. His intent was to end the session with a clean technique, something the room would remember, something that would serve as a conclusion to the afternoon story. He grabbed Ivy's collar from behind, both hands, the back of her neck, and the left shoulder. The left shoulder! Ivy's breath left her body in a sound like a word that didn't make it out. And then, for 1.5 seconds, her training took over. Her left hand came up and cleared his grip with a movement that was not Muay Thai and not Judo, and not any system civilian practitioners learned in commercial gyms. Her hip dropped and rotated. Her weight shifted to her right leg, then drove upward and back. Mason Boyce went sideways, not falling, controlled, redirect, but sideways and down to one knee, with Ivy's arm in a position that made his shoulder joint the decision point for what happened next. She held it. For exactly 4 seconds, Mason King Boyce knelt on the tatami of Combat Readiness Center Building 7, and his arm was in the keeping of a woman in a stained medical uniform. Then Ivy released. She stepped back, put space between them, straightened. The room was very quiet. Mason rose slowly. He looked at the arm she had released. He looked at his hands. He looked at the floor. He looked at Ivy. "What was that?" he said. Not a question, a processing statement. Ivy did not answer. That's not a system." Mason looked at Foster, who was standing 6 feet away with a clipboard he had stopped writing on. "What system was that?" Foster did not answer either. Noah Kimball had stopped moving. Connor Blake's phone was still up, but he had lowered his arms slightly, which meant the camera was now pointed at the floor. Ryan Archer had taken 3 steps backward and was standing against the equipment rack, and his expression had the quality of a person who has just realized the game changed while he wasn't paying attention. Bradley Norris was walking across the floor. He moved with the deliberate, measured pace of a 47-year-old who has learned not to hurry toward uncertain situations, not from caution, but from the understanding that arriving composed is more useful than arriving quickly. He stopped at a position from which he could see Ivy's face, and he stood there, and he looked at her. And what was visible in his expression was the specific quality of a man updating a model. Ivy looked back at him. Norris said nothing. He turned and walked back to his seat. Aldridge had stepped away from the terminal. He was holding his clipboard at his side, a different posture from his usual clipboard at chest administrative stance, a posture that meant the clipboard had ceased to be a tool and become a habit. He was looking at Ivy with an expression that was 3 parts professional reassessment and 1 part something he couldn't quite name. "Calloway," he said. "What's your background?" "Medical," Ivy said. "Before that," a pause, small, deliberate. Before that, Sergeant Major." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. He did not push. He looked at his clipboard. He looked at the terminal. He looked at Foster. 5-minute break, he said. "Dormisseur." The room shifted into the loose, standing-around configuration that a break produces, small clusters, phones out, the low hum of multiple conversations. Mason was with Connor in one corner. Noah Kimball had drifted to the edge of their orbit but was standing with his back slightly turned, which was a different posture than the one he had held before. Ryan Archer had moved to the water fountain on the south wall. Daisy Chen was standing beside Hazel Drummond, and both of them were looking at the floor with the expression of people talking about something neither wants to look at directly. Samuel Ezra came back through the northwest door. He moved back to his position in the corner. He looked at his phone one more time, then put it in his pocket. He looked at the front entrance, the main door, the one that faced the administrative parking area. His expression had settled into something that was not calm and not agitated, but was very specifically ready. Ivy was standing near the water station, not drinking, not on her phone. She had her hands loosely together in front of her, and she was looking at nothing in particular, which meant she was looking at everything, cataloging the room the way she had cataloged it when she entered, updating the information. She was aware of Ezra. She had been aware of him since he walked in. She had not reacted. She did not react now. What she did, quietly and without performing it, was reach up with her right hand and touch the left shoulder of her uniform. A brief contact, 2 fingers, the kind you make to confirm something is still in place. Then her hand came down. She resumed her neutral posture. Hazel appeared at her elbow. "Ivy?" Her voice was low, and it carried something new in it. Not the concern of an earlier exchange, not the sympathy of someone watching someone else be treated poorly, but the specific quality of a person who has begun to revise a picture she thought she understood. "That move," Hazel said. "I've never—" "What was that?" Ivy looked at her. "It was a response," she said. "To what?" "To the situation." A beat. "Get some water, Hazel. We're almost through." Hazel studied her for another 2 seconds. Then she went to get water. Mason crossed the floor from his corner, and for the first time in the session, he moved toward Ivy without the performance framing. No audience address, no raised voice, no managed presentation. He stopped a few feet away, and when he spoke, he was quiet. "Where did you really train?" Ivy looked at him. "Ohio State University," she said. "Nursing." He stared at her. "That's not what I just felt." She held his gaze. "Then you should report it to the Institutional Review Board." He didn't laugh. "I'm serious." "So am I." A long beat. Mason looked at the floor, looked at his hands, looked at her. "You're not just a nurse," he said. Ivy said nothing. Aldridge called the room back to session. Mason held eye contact for one more second. The eye contact of a person who has asked a question and received an answer that creates more questions, and then he turned and walked back to center. Ivy followed. The second half of the session had a different quality from the first. The laughter had migrated to the edges of the room and was now occasional, rather than steady. Connor Blake was still recording, but the captions he'd been composing had stalled out somewhere around the fourth exchange, because the content had stopped being what he'd expected it to be. It was during the second half that the thing with the collar happened. Mason had pressed Ivy toward the northeast corner, not with malice in this particular moment, but with the operational logic of someone who knows cornering creates advantage, and Ivy had circled, and Mason had followed. And then he reached out and grabbed the back of her collar with both hands and pulled. It was a strong grip, a real grip. And the collar of a medical uniform, which is not designed for combat, does not distribute force the way tactical gear does. The fabric tore. Not dramatically, not the full split of a movie scene. A pull along the left shoulder seam, roughly 4 inches from the collar line toward the sleeve. Enough to shift the fabric, enough to move it. And there, on Ivy Calloway's left shoulder, in the fluorescent light of Combat Readiness Center Building 7, at 2:51 p.m. on a Tuesday in August, was the edge of something that had no business being there. Black ink, geometric, precise. The unmistakable angular lines of a naval special warfare trident, rendered in the particular style of marks made by people who earn them rather than choose them. Below it, in a font that was not decorative but utilitarian, were the characters, Class 347. And below that, 2 characters that someone in this room was going to recognize. ST-6. Then the moment froze. 3 seconds, in which the room held. Hazel's breath went out of her in a sound that was too small to be a gasp, but was too audible to be nothing. Connor Blake's phone arm dropped to his side. Bradley Norris, who had been standing against the back wall, went very still in the way that only people with specific experiences go still when they see specific things, not from shock, but from recognition. Noah Kimball looked at Mason. Mason was looking at Ivy's shoulder with his hand still raised from where they had released the fabric. He looked like a man trying to read a language he had never encountered, but understanding, from the structure of it, that the message was serious. Ryan Archer was backing up, not running. Backing, the specific movement of someone who has just realized which direction they don't want to be in. And from the main door, the door that faced the administrative parking lot, the door that nobody had been watching, because everybody had been watching the floor, came the sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate, the footsteps of a person who walks through rooms rather than into them. General Ethan Forrester was 53 years old. He had 2 stars on his collar, a face that communicated nothing he had not decided to communicate, and the particular quality of presence that accumulates not from rank alone, but from a career spent in places where presence mattered in ways that couldn't be written in after-action reports. He had signed off on Operation Blackwater Recovery in August of 2019. He had read the incident report 11 times. He had recommended 3 of the 8 operators involved for commendations. He knew exactly what the trident on a left shoulder meant when it appeared alongside the numbers it was appearing alongside now. He crossed the floor. The room came to attention, not ordered, not commanded, automatic and immediate, the reflex of 43 people who recognized what had walked in through the door. Spines straightened, hands came to sides. The small conversations evaporated without ceremony. Mason Boyce, who had been facing away from the entrance, turned at the shift in the room's energy. He saw the stars. His posture snapped to attention with the specific urgency of someone who recognizes their timing problem. General Forrester did not look at Mason. He was looking at the left shoulder of Ivy Calloway's torn uniform. He crossed the remaining distance to the center of the floor and stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at the trident. He looked at the characters below it. He looked at Ivy. Then, without preamble, without performance, without any of the framing that such gestures typically arrive with, he raised his right hand to his temple in a formal military salute and held it there. "Petty Officer First Class Calloway," he said. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Samuel Ezra from the northwest corner straightened and brought his hand up. Jasper Coldwell, who had spent the last 20 minutes watching with the expression of a man doing increasingly specific arithmetic, raised his. Bradley Norris, who had not cried in any context his colleagues could remember, pressed his lips together and lifted his arm, and his hand was, at the end, not completely steady. Carter Aldridge's clipboard hit the floor. He did not pick it up. Mason Boyce was standing 3 feet from Ivy, and he was looking at the face of a woman who had not moved, had not smiled, had not produced any expression that the room could read and use as a reference point. She was looking at General Forrester with the expression of someone who has been found in a place they chose to be unfound and is working out what that means now. Forrester lowered his hand. He turned to Mason, and his voice was quiet in the way that things are quiet when they contain something very heavy. "Step aside, Specialist." Mason stepped aside. "We're halfway through, and Mason still hasn't figured it out. But Sergeant Major Aldridge is starting to ask questions, and General Forrester's vehicle just pulled through the front gate. If someone sent you this video, welcome. Subscribe now, because the next 60 seconds are going to change everything you think you know about Ivy Calloway. Stay until the very end. The final mystery we reveal will keep you thinking for days." Forrester reached into his left chest pocket and removed something small. A photograph, 3 by 4 inches, slightly worn at the corner. He held it out to Ivy. She looked at it without taking it for a moment. Then she took it. The photograph showed 8 figures in tactical gear, standing in dust-colored light, with the particular quality of posture that people have immediately after something hard has ended, and before they have had time to decide how to carry it. The figure in the center was not identifiable by face. The angle was partial, the resolution civilian, but the posture was specific and unmistakable to anyone in that room, with the context to read it. "Operation Blackwater Recovery," Forrester said. "August of 2019. All 8 operators returned." He paused. "Dr. Samuel Ezra filed the after-action medical report. He's been waiting 4 years to say something to you." Ivy did not look at Ezra. She looked at the photograph. She folded it carefully along an existing crease and held it in both hands. "It was my job," she said. 6 words, no amplification. The room received them in silence. Liam Foster, who had been standing with his arms crossed for the past 3 minutes, released his arms. He exhaled through his nose. He looked at Mason with an expression that was not angry, but was very thoroughly done. Mason was staring at the photograph in Ivy's hands. He was staring at the trident. He was staring at the characters below it, which he now understood the meaning of, and his face was doing something complicated and not particularly flattering to him. He started, stopped, started again. "She was a petty officer first class with SEAL Team 6, Forrester said, without heat, without drama, as a statement of record. She completed basic underwater demolition/SEAL training as a member of Class 347. She served 7 operational years before accepting a reassignment to medical support." He looked at Mason in the specific way that senior officers look at junior personnel when they want the look to be instructional rather than punitive. She was also the ranking combatives qualified operator in this room for the entirety of this session. Connor Blake's phone was on the floor. He had not picked it up. Noah Kimball had moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but he had moved 3 steps to the left, which had taken him out of Mason's immediate orbit and into something more like neutral territory. Hazel Drummond was crying, which she appeared to be only partially aware of. She was looking at Ivy with an expression that contained an entire revision of a year's worth of understanding. Daisy Chen had her phone up, not pointed at Mason, pointed at Ivy. Ivy was looking at nothing in particular again, or at everything. The distinction was one the room didn't have the vocabulary to navigate. Sergeant Major Carter Aldridge reached down and picked up his clipboard. He looked at it. He looked at Ivy. He looked at the terminal where he had been searching her file 20 minutes ago, the file that had returned nursing degree and no combat history. and his expression was the expression of a man who has just understood a very specific category of mistake. "The file," he started, "is accurate as it was compiled," Forrester said. "The rest of the record is held elsewhere." Aldridge closed his mouth, opened it, closed it again. Bradley Norris crossed the floor and stood in front of Ivy. He was 47 and did not, as a rule, make gestures that could be called symbolic. He extended his right hand. "Fallujah, 2004, he said. "I was on the other side of the wire in a different uniform. I spent 20 minutes of this session doubting what I was watching." He paused. "I was wrong to doubt it. I'm sorry it took the evidence to get me there." Ivy looked at his hand. She shook it. It was the first time she had made a gesture of warmth toward anyone in the room. It lasted 2 seconds, and then she released his hand and returned to her posture, and her expression settled back to neutral. But something in the room had shifted in those 2 seconds. The way a temperature shifts when a door opens, small but pervasive, something everyone feels before they can name it. Mason Boyce was still standing where General Forrester had told him to step aside. He had not moved. His arms were at his sides. He was looking at the floor, which was not something Mason Boyce did in public, and which made him look for the first time in the session like a person dealing with a reality rather than performing for one. "That technique," he said finally, to no one in particular, "the one you used on my wrist, the second time, that's from SEAL Combative's program?" A long pause. Ivy looked at him. "Among other things," she said. Mason nodded. He looked at the floor again. He nodded again. And then he turned and walked to where Connor Blake was standing, and he said, low and without an audience this time, "Take it down." Connor looked at him. "The video? All of it?" A pause. "Now." Connor looked at his phone. He looked at Ivy. He started deleting. Forrester had moved to stand beside Aldridge, and the two of them were speaking in the low, deliberate register of people conducting a professional accounting that both of them understand will be continued elsewhere in greater detail. Aldridge's clipboard was pressed flat against his chest now, a posture Hazel had never seen him use, and which she somehow understood to mean something about how a person holds themselves when they are no longer certain of the official version of a situation. Samuel Ezra crossed the floor from the northwest corner. He stopped at a respectful distance from Ivy, not close, not presumptuous, the distance of someone who has something to say and is deciding whether this is the moment. "I was in Kandahar," he said. "I was the medic on the follow-on team. I've been here 3 weeks." He paused. "I've been working out how to say this for 3 weeks." Ivy looked at him. Her expression did not change, but something behind it did, something small and specific and not visible to most of the room. "You didn't owe me anything," she said. "No," Ezra agreed, "but I wanted you to know that someone in this building knew." A beat. "I know," she said. He nodded. He stepped back. The session was over. Aldridge had confirmed it formally 3 minutes earlier, but the room had actually ended before that. Ended in the moment when the clipboard hit the floor, or possibly before, in the moment when the fabric tore and the mark on her shoulder became visible. The physical dismissal was just the room catching up to something that had already happened. People were collecting their things with the specific economy of motion that people use when they want to appear to be going about their business while actually watching something very carefully. Charlotte Wren, civilian contractor, stationed near the east wall, had her phone pressed to her ear and was moving toward the exit with the purposeful urgency of someone who has information that needs to travel. Jasper Coldwell lingered. He was 51, 2 tours in Iraq, current base intelligence liaison, and he had the particular gift of knowing when to leave a room and when to remain in one. He was in the remaining in category. He stood near the storage units, making himself available without demanding participation. Ryan Archer was not lingering. Ryan Archer was at the south exit, moving with the controlled pace of someone who has assessed the landscape and selected the most efficient route out of it. Forrester watched him go. He said to Aldridge evenly, "I'll want a word with Archer." "Yes, sir," Aldridge said. "Today." "Yes, sir." General Forrester looked across the room at Ivy, who was straightening the torn collar of her uniform with the same precise, unhurried movements she had used to fold her medical gloves at the beginning of the session. And his expression, for just a moment, was the expression of a man who has the particular satisfaction of seeing a record corrected. Then he turned to Aldridge, and his face returned to the communicating only what he has decided quality it had carried when he walked in. "I have something for Calloway," he said. "I'll need 5 minutes. Conference room B is open, sir." "Good." He moved toward Ivy, and the room, which had been conducting its various processes of departure and reassessment and documentation, slowed, not because it was told to, but because it understood that the next thing to happen was the important thing. And the important thing was between these two people, and whatever it was worth staying to see. The 5 minutes General Forrester had requested turned into 7, and in those 7 minutes, the Combat Readiness Center underwent the quiet transformation that spaces undergo when the central fact of a situation has changed, and everyone in the room is in the process of adjusting to what that means. Connor Blake had deleted the videos, all 3 clips, the still photograph he had grabbed from the second one, and the draft caption he had been composing when the session changed direction. He stood near the south wall with his phone in his pocket and his arms crossed, which was not his usual posture, and he was looking at the floor with the expression of a person doing a retrospective accounting of the last 90 minutes and not arriving at a favorable balance. Noah Kimball had drifted further from Mason's orbit, not aggressively, not with any performed distance, but with the natural, incremental withdrawal of someone responding to a change in gravitational pull. He was now standing with Jasper Coldwell and a man named Kellerman from the Logistics Division, and they were talking in the low register of people who are pretending to discuss something neutral while actually discussing something else. Mason Boyce was sitting on the bench along the north wall. This was significant because Mason Boyce did not sit on benches in training rooms. Mason Boyce occupied floor space, center floor, active space, the kind of space that announced presence. The bench was where you put your bag. It was peripheral furniture. Mason was sitting on it with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he was looking at the tatami, and his face was doing the thing faces do when a person is trying to work out where a story began that ended here. Liam Foster was beside Aldridge near the terminal. They were speaking, and Aldridge was writing, not typing, pulling a small notepad from his chest pocket and using a pen, which was the sign of a man documenting something he wants to remember precisely rather than approximately. Hazel Drummond had stopped crying. She was standing near the equipment wall with Daisy Chen, and Daisy was still holding her phone with the quiet grip of someone who has recorded something but isn't sure what to do with it yet. Hazel was not telling her what to do with it. Hazel was processing her own version of the last 90 minutes, which was a version that required her to go back through 3 months of small moments, the shift handoffs where Ivy arrived already aware of what had happened in the hours before, the patient crises where Ivy's specific quality of stillness had the effect of making everything around it slow down. The one Tuesday in March when a security alert had moved through the base and Ivy had positioned herself between the exit and the junior staff without anyone asking her to, and understand all of those moments differently. Bradley Norris was standing near the door, not blocking it, not positioned as anything, just standing in the way that some veterans stand near exits, not from fear, not from operational instinct, so much as from the habit of knowing where the thresholds are. Conference room B was through the corridor, and 20 feet to the left, the door was closed. Through the reinforced glass panel beside the door, 2 figures were visible, one in 2-star insignia, one in a torn medical uniform, and the body language of both conveyed, even through glass and distance, that the conversation happening inside was the kind that settles things. What could be seen but not heard? Forrester reaching into his jacket and producing an envelope, standard size, unsealed, the kind used for internal communication, and placing it on the table between them. Ivy looking at it, not picking it up. Forrester saying something, V saying something, a pause that lasted long enough to be deliberate. Then Ivy picking up the envelope and placing it on the table beside her, not opening it, keeping her hand on it for a moment, and then releasing it. Then Forrester saying something else, and Ivy's head turning slightly to the left, the involuntary movement of a person hearing a specific word they did not expect, and then returning to neutral, then both of them standing. Forrester extended his hand. Ivy shook it. The handshake was brief, professional, and carried the specific quality of handshakes between people who have a shared history that doesn't require reinforcement through gesture. Then Forrester said something final, and Ivy nodded once, and Forrester moved to the door. He stepped back into the corridor, and his gaze swept the room, the way all general officer gazes sweep rooms, cataloging, categorizing, assigning status, and then he moved to Aldridge. I want a full session review on my desk by 0800 tomorrow. pairings protocol, safety documentation, and a note about Archer. He looked at Aldridge with the specific quality that communicates both instruction and expectation simultaneously. The note about Archer should be thorough. Yes, sir. Foster. Forrester turned to the combat instructor. Calloway's training history. If someone asks you about it, you don't know anything. Foster looked at him. I don't know anything about it, sir. Good. The faintest indication of approval. Keep it that way until you're told otherwise. Then Forrester crossed the room toward the main exit, and the room came to attention again without being ordered to, and he walked through it and out. And the door swung shut behind him with the same measured weight it had opened with, and the room exhaled. Ivy came out of conference room B 30 seconds later. She was carrying the envelope at her side, and the tear in her shoulder seam was still visible, and her expression was exactly what it had been when she walked into the room 92 minutes ago. Not harder, not softer, not performing anything in either direction. She crossed the floor toward the equipment area where she had stored her bag. Mason Boyce stood up from the bench. The room noticed. The room always noticed when Mason moved, and it noticed this particular movement with a specific quality of attention. The attention given to a thing that is about to be either dignified or not dignified, and the watching has a stake in which direction it goes. Mason walked toward Ivy. His stride was different from the stride that had carried him across this floor at the beginning of the session. Quieter, without the managed weight of performance. He stopped at an appropriate distance, and he looked at her, and he said nothing for 2 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than Mason Boyce usually spent gathering language. I was wrong, he said. About all of it. Ivy looked at him. She waited. The way I talked to you. He glanced briefly toward Hazel and Daisy, then back to Ivy. The way I let them laugh. He paused. That wasn't... He stopped, started again. I'm sorry. Ivy was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was even, not warm and not cold. Tell that to them, she said, with a small movement of her chin toward Hazel and Daisy. I'm not the one who needs to hear it most. Mason looked at Hazel. Hazel looked at him with the expression of someone who is deciding whether an apology is being offered in the right direction. He crossed the floor to her. He said something. From a distance, the words were private, but the posture was unambiguous. Shoulders level, no performance. The posture of someone doing something he doesn't know how to do, but is doing it anyway, because it needs to be done. Hazel listened. Then she said something back, brief and direct. Mason nodded. He moved to Daisy, and the same exchange happened, and when it was done, Daisy looked down at her phone and then put it in her pocket without explanation. Connor Blake had been watching this from the south wall. When Mason turned back from Daisy, Connor met his eyes. There was a brief exchange, two people recalibrating what they were to each other in a context that had shifted, and then Connor looked away first, which was something that had probably never happened before, and which both of them registered. Noah Kimball peeled quietly from the Coldwell-Kellerman cluster and walked to the exit without any announcement. Aldridge was at the terminal again, but not searching. He was reading. He had found something. The look on his face was the look of someone encountering documentation that does not align with the documentation they have been working from, and he was reading it slowly, with the specific attention of a man making a retroactive inventory of all the moments in the last 3 years that this information would have changed. 3 years. Ivy Calloway had been in Building 7 before. Not this building, but the base, the trails, the gym at 0500 when most people were still assembling themselves toward the day, the mess hall during the quiet hour before the morning rush. 3 years of someone moving through this base in a specific way, with a specific quality of presence, and no one having had the occasion to ask the right question. Liam Foster came to stand beside Aldridge and looked at the screen. He read for 30 seconds. He said quietly, "Holy cow." Aldridge looked at him. "That's one way to put it." "Class 347. Foster shook his head slowly. "I knew one of those operators. From the integration cohort." He paused. He never talked about her by name. He talked about Ghost. Aldridge looked at him. "Ghost." "That's the call sign." Foster looked across the room at Ivy. "Nobody talked about Ghost by anything else. I asked him once, 'Who was Ghost?' He just said, 'You'd know if you were there.'" He paused. "I understand that now." Ezra caught Ivy at the water station. She was filling a cup, her back to the room, the envelope tucked under her left arm. He approached from the side, visible, unhurried, announcing himself through proximity rather than sound, the specific movement of a person who has spent time in situations where coming up on someone without warning carries consequences. She did not turn immediately. She filled the cup, drank half, and then turned. "How long have you been here?" she said. 3 weeks, he said. "I told you. I know what you told me. I mean, how long have you known?" Ezra looked at her. "A beat. Since day one. You were making rounds in Ward 3 when I arrived. You came around a corner and I saw your stance and I—" He paused. "I knew." Ivy looked at the half-empty cup in her hand. "And you didn't say anything. You didn't want me to." She looked at him now. A direct look. The kind that costs something to hold. "How did you know that?" "Because if you'd wanted it said, you'd have said it yourself." He paused. "You made a choice to be somewhere quiet for a while. I wasn't going to take that from you." A long moment. "Kandahar," she said, not a question. "I was the medic on the follow-on team. We came in 37 minutes behind you." He paused. Walsh had a through and through in the upper left quadrant. The field dressing was— He stopped. It kept him alive for 37 minutes in a way that shouldn't have been possible with the resources available. It was the most precise emergency application I'd ever seen from someone working outside a medical context. Ivy said nothing. "Walsh came to see me last year," Ezra continued. "He asked me if I'd ever found out who had put that dressing on him. I told him I hadn't." He looked at her steadily. "I wasn't ready to have that conversation with him yet. Or maybe with myself." A pause. "I called Forrester this morning. When I saw what was happening in this room, It seemed like the time." Ivy was quiet for a moment. Then, "How is Walsh?" Ezra's expression shifted, not dramatically, but in a way that contained an entire story. "He re-enlisted. He's in Coronado." A pause. "He thinks about what happened in that sector more than he lets on." "They all do." She nodded. A single motion, accepting this information the way you accept something you already knew but needed to hear confirmed. "Tell him," she said finally, "that the dressing was a standard field application." She paused. "And that I was glad it held." Ezra nodded. "I'll tell him." She handed him the empty cup to dispose of. Not rudely, not imperiously, the automatic efficiency of someone accustomed to handing things off in motion, and walked toward the equipment wall to collect her bag. Hazel was waiting. Not positioned in the way of departure, Hazel knew better than to put herself in the way of Ivy's departure, but present, nearby, in the way that people who want to say something make themselves available without demanding. She was sitting on the edge of the equipment bench with her own bag on her knees, and when Ivy came close enough, she looked up. "Can I ask you something?" Hazel said. Ivy picked up her bag, held it at her side. "Ask." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Hazel's voice was careful, genuinely curious, not accusatory, not the question of someone who thought Ivy owed her an explanation, but the question of someone who has just discovered a new dimension of a person they thought they understood and is trying to understand it more completely. 3 years. You've been here 3 years. Why not? Why not just— "Because some days," Ivy said, "I just want to be a nurse." The words were quiet and flat and did not perform anything. They landed in the space between them and stayed there. Hazel looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not pity, because Ivy was not producing the conditions for pity, but something closer to the specific understanding that comes when you realize that a person's silence has been a choice rather than a lack, and that the choice cost something. "Okay," Hazel said. That was all she said. Ivy shouldered her bag. She looked at Hazel with the same directness she had used when she looked at Ezra, and there was something in it that was perhaps the closest Ivy Calloway had come to warmth in the last 93 minutes. "You're good at your job," she said. "You're going to be excellent at your job." Hazel's throat moved. "Thank you. Get some rest before tomorrow's shift." Ivy moved toward the door. 0600, second trauma rotation. We have 2 post-op observations." And that was that. The transition from whatever this had been back to the coordinates of the work, which was where Ivy Calloway apparently preferred to locate herself. Hazel watched her go and felt oddly that she had understood something true. First, Daisy Chen was at the main door. She was not blocking it. She was standing beside it in the specific posture of someone who has been rehearsing what they want to say and is now determining whether they still want to say it. She was 23 years old, and had been at Fort Bragg for 7 months, and she had signed up with a set of intentions about what she wanted to become that the last 7 months had done some work to complicate. Ivy came toward the door and Daisy straightened. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I want to train," she said. "For real. Not mandatory sessions. Real training." She paused. I know you don't know me. I know you don't owe me anything. She stopped. "I watched you today and I thought, that's what I want to be able to do. Not the," she gestured vaguely toward the center of the room. "Not the performance of it, the actual thing." Ivy looked at her. The evaluation was brief and thorough and unhurried. "Monday," Ivy said. 0500, North Running Track." Daisy's expression went through several things very quickly. "I'll be there." "Bring water," Ivy said. "We won't be stopping for it." She pushed through the door and into the corridor. The corridor between Building 7 and the main administrative wing was one of those functional, fluorescent-lit spaces that nobody would describe as anything other than what it was, a way to get from one place to another. It ran 60 feet between two sets of double doors, and at 2:59 p.m. on a Tuesday in August, Ivy Calloway walked the length of it alone, the envelope under her arm, and the bag on her shoulder, and the tear at her shoulder seam catching the overhead light. She walked the way she had walked into the training room 94 minutes ago, careful, not hurried, but something had shifted in the texture of it, which was not visible and would not have been legible to most observers, but was present. The particular quality of carrying a thing that has been dislodged from the position you had placed it in. She stopped at the end of the corridor, beside the double doors that led to the administrative parking area. Through the reinforced glass, the August light was still white and direct, the way it gets in the middle of the afternoon when the sun has not yet committed to descent. A pair of junior officers crossed the lot in conversation. A supply vehicle was backed against the loading dock. Ivy put her back to the wall beside the door. She took out the envelope. She looked at it for a moment. The official internal stationery, the handwritten notation in the top right corner in Forrester's specific compressed print. She opened it. She read it. The contents were not visible. What was visible was Ivy's face. Still, as it had been throughout the session, but with a different quality to the stillness now. The stillness of a person who is processing something with real weight rather than managing the responses of a room. Her eyes moved across the page at the pace of someone reading carefully rather than quickly. She reached the end. She read it again from the top. Then she folded it back into the envelope. She pressed it flat between her palms for a moment, the gesture of someone deciding what to do with a thing. Then she put it in the front pocket of her bag, beneath her stethoscope and her trauma shears. She pushed through the double doors into the afternoon. The room she had left behind was still in the process of resolving itself. Bradley Norris had stayed, partly from the specific instinct of ceremonious veterans, partly because he wanted to talk to Aldridge, and partly because Jasper Coldwell had stayed, and the two of them had the kind of unspoken agreement that forms between people who have been in enough situations that they recognize when the full accounting of one has not yet been reached. "You knew something was off," Coldwell said. He was not asking. Norris looked at him. "I knew something didn't fit. I spent 20 minutes talking myself out of it." He paused. "That's the part I'm going to think about." "The dismissal." "The dismissal," Norris confirmed. "The ease of it. She walks in, she looks the way she looks, and I put her in a box before she'd done anything." He looked at the tatami. The same tatami where, 40 minutes ago, a woman had absorbed a strike to a shoulder carrying 4-year-old scar tissue and not made a sound about it. "I should have known better. I thought I did know better." Coldwell was quiet for a moment. "The question is, what it takes to get from knowing better to doing better." "Apparently it takes a general walking through the door. For most of us," Coldwell said. "Some people never get there even then." Norris looked across the room to where Mason Boyce was still sitting, not on the bench now, but on the floor, back against the north wall, which was a different category of sitting entirely, and communicated something about where he had arrived in his understanding of the last 2 hours. Connor Blake was not nearby. The orbit had dissolved. "That kid is going to be okay," Norris said. Coldwell looked at Mason. "Eventually. That's usually how it goes." Mason Boyce sat with his back against the north wall of Building 7 and did what he had not done in the room when there were people to perform in front of. He let himself understand what had happened. Not the facts of it sucked. The facts were clear, and he had no defense against them. What he was working through was the texture of it, the specific shape of the error. He had looked at Ivy Calloway, and he had constructed a story so quickly, so automatically, that he had not noticed the construction happening. White uniform, small frame, stained sleeve, late arrival. He had assembled those elements into a conclusion, and then he had performed the conclusion to a room. And the room had rewarded him for it, and the reward had validated the construction, and none of that had required him to look more carefully at any point. He thought about her left shoulder, the mark beneath the torn seam, the letters and numbers that represented a program with a graduation rate that professional athletes trained for years and sometimes never achieved. He thought about what it took to earn that mark, and what it meant that she had carried it in a building full of military personnel for 3 years without anyone seeing it. And he thought about the particular quality of her stillness during the session. Not the stillness of someone afraid and trying to minimize themselves, but the stillness of someone choosing, continuously, not to use what they had. He thought about the grip on his wrist, the specific quality of the force she had applied and then arrested. He had felt it end before it completed, felt it the way you feel a word that's been cut off mid-sentence. The shape of what it was going toward was unmistakable, and what it was going toward was an ending that would have been definitive. She had stopped it. Not from inability, from decision. He sat with that for a while. When Carter Aldridge came and stood in front of him, Mason looked up and straightened his spine. Not performatively, just the reflex of a man raised in a military family who stands up when a senior NCO approaches. "On your feet, boys." Mason stood. Aldridge looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a sergeant major who has something to communicate that falls outside the clean categories of reprimand or endorsement. "I'm going to tell you something," Aldridge said, "and I want you to understand that I'm telling you as someone who also got it wrong today. Not the same way you did, but I got it wrong." Mason said nothing. "What happened in this room today is going to go into your record." Aldridge held up a hand before Mason could speak, not as a disciplinary notation, as a learning event, the way we document things that matter. He looked at Mason steadily. "You're good. You know you're good. That's not the problem. The problem is that you decided who she was before she did anything. That's a liability. In a room, it's an embarrassment. In the field, it gets people killed." Mason absorbed this. "Yes, Sergeant Major, get your gear. Report to your OIC by 1600. You have an apology to make to Specialist Archer's training supervisor for the distraction he created today, and you're going to deliver it in person." Mason looked at him. "Archer? Archer is being handled separately. You are responsible for the climate you created in this room today. That climate allowed Archer's behavior to happen without correction. That's on you." A pause. "Understood?" "Yes, Sergeant Major." Aldridge held his gaze for one more second, the second in which an NCO communicates everything that the official language cannot contain. And then he nodded once and turned away. Mason picked up his bag. He looked at the tatami one more time. He looked at the place on the north side of the mat where Ivy Calloway had stood for the entirety of the session, taking up a precise amount of space, neither more nor less, and somehow managing that space such that it had turned out to contain considerably more than anyone in the room had accounted for. He walked out. The kiosk in the medical wing corridor was running low on coffee by 3:15. This was normal for a Tuesday afternoon, and the orderly who restocked it twice a week had developed the instinct to check it before 4 o'clock, or face the particular disapproval of the evening shift nurses who arrived at 4:30 and found a half-empty carafe. Ivy came into the medical wing through the east entrance at 3:22. She had changed in the locker room. Clean scrubs, white coat, hair repinned. The torn uniform was in her locker. The envelope was in the front pocket of her bag, which was on her left shoulder. Grace Sutton, senior nurse and Ivy's supervisor in the administrative hierarchy that both of them understood was not the full picture of what that hierarchy actually contained, was at the nurse's station reviewing discharge paperwork. She was 52, had worked military medical for 27 years. And had the specific quality of someone who had seen enough things to not require explanation for most of them. She looked up when Ivy came in. She looked at Ivy's face. She looked at Ivy's left shoulder where the clean scrub top showed nothing. She said without preamble, "Charlotte Wren was on the phone for 17 minutes. Ivy set her bag under the desk. "I know, By tomorrow morning, the whole base is going to know what happened in Building 7. I know. Grace put her pen down. She looked at Ivy with the expression of a woman deciding whether to ask a thing she has not asked in 3 years, because the person she might ask it of has not shown any openness to being asked it. Are you all right? She said. Ivy considered this question in a way that suggested she was taking it seriously rather than deflecting it. I'm working through some things, she said. The envelope? Ivy looked at her. Ethan Forrester has been trying to get you back in an operational context for 2 years, Grace said. Everybody knows, Ivy. Not the whole story, but the broad strokes. People who want to know things know things. She paused. What did he give you? Ivy reached into the front pocket of her bag and took out the envelope. She held it for a moment, then put it back. A choice, she said. Grace looked at her. And I haven't made it yet. A beat. But you're considering it. Ivy was quiet for a moment. Outside the window behind the nurse's station, the late afternoon was beginning to soften. The particular quality of August light past 3 o'clock, when the white direct glare starts to shift toward the gold of early evening. On the base running track, visible in the distance through the window glass, a single figure was already completing a lap, moving with the efficient, unhurried stride of someone who uses exercise the way other people use sleep. Sector 9 is active again, Ivy said. Grace's expression did not change. She had the quality of a woman who has heard serious things seriously described and does not produce theater in response to either. Which means the people who need someone who knows the ground there are running out of time to find them. A pause. And I know the ground there. Silence for a moment. Grace picked up her pen, put it down again. What happened in that sector? She said. Kandahar, 2019. You've never told anyone. Ivy looked at the window. The figure on the track had completed another lap and was beginning a third. We lost communication at 2200, she said. Her voice was level, not emotionless, but managed, the voice of someone describing an event they have reconstructed into a form they can carry. The team was in a compound on the south edge of the sector. 14 minutes into the breach, the extraction route closed. IED on the primary egress, secondary was compromised. A pause. We had a choice, hold and wait for extraction that might not come in time, or move through a tertiary route that was uncleared. You moved, Grace said. I moved. A pause. Walsh took a hit at the third gate. Through and through, upper left quadrant. He could walk, but not for long. She stopped. I knew the dressing had to hold for 37 minutes minimum, because that was how long the follow-on team needed to reach our coordinates. So I made a dressing that held for 37 minutes. Grace was very still. We all got out, Ivy said. All 8 of us. Walsh was in surgery in Kandahar by midnight. A long silence. And after? After I asked for a reassignment. Ivy's voice was even. Not because I couldn't continue. Because I'd been carrying the weight of keeping 8 people alive through a situation that should have been called off 3 days earlier. And I needed to put that weight down somewhere quiet for a while. She looked at her bag, at the pocket where the envelope was. Fort Bragg is a quiet place, she said. Relatively. Grace looked at her for a long time. Then she said, and now it's not quiet anymore. No, Ivy said. Now it's not quiet anymore. The canteen at Building 14 was half full at 5 p.m., the way it always was in the transitional hour between the afternoon shift and the evening shift. A mix of people coming off days and people preparing for nights, the particular social ecosystem of a military base at shift change. The long table near the east windows was traditionally occupied by a cluster of veterans who had been at Fort Bragg long enough to have opinions about its changes, most of which they expressed through implication and silence and the occasional blunt sentence. Jasper Coldwell was already there when Bradley Norris arrived with a tray. Norris sat across from him. They did not speak for the first 2 minutes, which was within normal parameters for their particular version of conversation. Then Coldwell said, "She's going to take the assignment." Norris picked up his coffee. "You don't know that. I know the type." Coldwell looked at his tray. "And I know what Sector 9 means to the people who've worked it. It has a gravity to it." A pause. "You don't walk away from gravity that calls you by name." Norris was quiet for a moment. "She chose to walk away once. She chose to rest," Coldwell said. "There's a difference." They ate in the particular silence of 2 men who have reached a conclusion they're comfortable not narrating. At the far end of the table, Jasper Coldwell looked toward the window. 3 tables over, a group of junior officers were talking about something that required a lot of hand gestures and had the energy of a story being told for the first time. At the table nearest the door, Two women from the administrative division were looking at their phones with the synchronized intensity of people who have both received the same information and are cross-referencing it. Charlotte Wren's 17-minute phone call had done its work. The information was moving through the base the way information moves through closed systems. Not uniformly, not completely accurately, but thoroughly, with the particular velocity that stories about hidden things achieve when the hiding is revealed. By tomorrow morning, Norris thought, the story would be part of the base's collective memory. The kind of thing that gets referenced in passing years later. Remember when Calloway, the nurse, turned out to be acquiring the slightly legendary quality that accumulates around things that happen in specific rooms on specific afternoons and then become permanently attached to those rooms. He thought about the tap of a shoe against the floor, the way Ryan Archer had manufactured distance from the mat when the general walked in, the 17 phone calls that Charlotte Wren had probably made by now. He thought about Ivy's face when she shook his hand, the 2 seconds of something that was not quite warmth, but was in the vicinity of warmth, and the way it closed as quickly as it had opened, like a door swinging shut and then correcting to the angle it was meant to hold. "She'll be all right," Norris said, not about the assignment, about everything. "She was all right before today," Coldwell said. "Today just made it visible." At 6:47 p.m., the locker room on the east side of Building 7 was empty. The overhead lights had dimmed to their after-hours setting. Lower, more economical, casting the space in a quality of light that was neither day nor night. The lockers stood in their rows with the impassive quality of structures that have witnessed considerable human experience, without accumulating any opinion about it. Ivy's locker was the fourth from the left in the third row. She came into the room from the corridor, bag on her shoulder, and stood in front of it for a moment before opening it. The torn uniform was inside, folded on the top shelf. She had folded it with the same precision she brought to everything. Along the proper seams, damage inward, the kind of fold that prepares a garment for whatever comes next rather than abandoning it to entropy. She took it out. She examined the tear. 4 inches along the left shoulder seam, clean pull, the kind of damage that a skilled seamstress could address, or that required replacement of the garment entirely. She folded it again, put it back. She changed into her civilian clothes, jeans, a long-sleeved gray shirt, and sat on the bench with her bag on her knees, and the locker room to herself, and the kind of quiet that follows complicated days. She reached into the front pocket of her bag and took out the envelope. She opened it again. Read it again, though she had read it 4 times already, and the words were not going to change between readings. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph was the operational brief, Sector 9, Northeastern Quadrant of the Kandahar Province, classified operation active for the past 11 months. Current team in need of an operator with specific ground knowledge and medical qualifications and operational experience of the particular kind that very few people carried, and that the theater had a documented need for. The second paragraph was shorter. It said, "This is not an order. Your current posting stands as long as you want it, if you want it." Then it said, in Forrester's compressed print, below the official signature, "Ghost. You know the ground needs you again. Whatever you decide, what you did in August of 19 has been in my thoughts for 4 years. Every single one of those 8 operators is because of you. I wanted to say that in a room, not in a file." She folded the letter back into the envelope. She sat with it between her palms. The locker room was quiet in the way that spaces are quiet when the day's activity has passed through them and left. She was aware of her left shoulder, the dull, specific ache of the old scar tissue activated by the afternoon's exertion, and she pressed 2 fingers to it, briefly, and the ache acknowledged the pressure and continued at its own pace. She thought about Walsh in Coronado, thinking about a sector he'd walked out of because a dressing held for 37 minutes. She thought about Hazel Drummond at 0600 tomorrow, professional and present, and developing into something excellent. She thought about Daisy Chen at 0500 Monday, on the north running track, with water, ready for the thing she had asked for. She thought about a telephone number that would not appear in any directory. She thought about Sector 9. She put the envelope in the inside pocket of her bag, against the lining, where it would not shift or crease. She stood up. She shouldered the bag. She looked at her locker for a moment. The torn uniform on the top shelf, the stethoscope hanging on the hook, the a small collection of items that accumulate in a space you occupy regularly over 3 years. She closed the locker. She walked out of Building 7 and into the evening. Fort Bragg at dusk has a particular quality that its residents describe in different ways depending on their history with it. The light goes gold and then amber along the flat, open stretches between buildings, and the flagpoles stand in it, with the specific gravity of things that have not moved and will not move, and the sounds of the bass, engines, voices, the distant percussion of training activity settle into a lower register as the day's official business transitions into the business that happens after hours. Ivy walked across the administrative lot toward her vehicle. The air had lost the afternoon's direct heat but retained its warmth, the particular temperature of August evenings that have been storing solar energy all day and release it slowly. She walked with the same quality she had walked with into Building 7 that morning, careful, unhurried, aware of the space around her. She reached her vehicle, put her bag on the passenger seat, sat behind the wheel. Her phone was on the seat beside her. She had turned the ringer off for the training session and had not turned it back on. She picked it up now. 7 notifications. 3 were from Hazel. A message sent at 5:30 that said, "Thank you for what you said," and 2 brief ones after that, practical things about tomorrow's shift. One was from a number she recognized as the Fort Bragg administrative office, likely something about the session review Aldridge had been instructed to compile. 2 were from numbers she did not recognize, and one, the last one, received at 6:43 p.m., was from a number that had no name, no area code she could assign to a region. The kind of number that appears on a screen the way certain things appear, deliberately, with the knowledge that the person receiving it will understand its significance. She looked at it for a moment. She pressed call. It rang twice. A voice she recognized answered. Male, low, unhurried, carrying the specific quality of someone who is in a situation that requires economy of language, and has been in that situation long enough to have stopped noticing it. Ghost, the voice said, not a greeting, a confirmation. She looked through the windshield at the base in the evening light, the flagpoles and the long buildings and the running track in the distance where tomorrow a figure would begin a lap, and then another, and then another. Sector 9 is active, she said. 11 months, the voice confirmed. We've been rebuilding the picture from the east grid. We're missing coverage on the south. I know the south. I know you do. A pause. Forrester said you'd call. Forrester hopes a lot of things, Ivy said. A sound that might have been a laugh, brief and professional. He's usually right. She was quiet for a moment. Through the windshield, the last of the amber light was moving up the flagpole in the way that light retreats before it disappears entirely. I have responsibilities here, she said. I know. Medical staff depending on me, a training commitment starting Monday. I'm aware we have a 60-day window before the operation requires the ground element. That gives you time to transition your responsibilities. 60 days, give or take. She pressed her left shoulder against the seat back. The scar tissue ached at the pressure, acknowledged it, and continued. She thought about 8 people standing in dust-colored light, in a photograph that was now folded in the inside pocket of her bag. She thought about the specific quality of knowing a ground, its textures and gradients, and the way it behaves in the night hours. The particular intelligence that comes from having been in a place when the place was trying to kill you, and learning its logic anyway. She thought about what that knowledge was worth to the people who needed it and did not have it. She thought about Daisy Chen at 0500. She thought about Hazel at 0600. She thought about a locker room with a torn uniform on the top shelf and a stethoscope on the hook. I need 3 days, she said, to make arrangements. A pause. You have them. Then I'll be in contact. Copy that? A pause. Ghost. Yeah, it's good to hear your voice. She said nothing to that. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand and the evening settling into the specific quality of dark that follows amber, and the bass quieting around her into the sounds of after hours, and the envelope in her bag against the lining, and the ache in her shoulder that she carried the way you carry things you have chosen to keep. Then she started the vehicle. She pulled out of the administrative lot and onto the base road, and the flagpoles passed on her left, and the running track passed on her right, and Building 7 passed behind her and grew smaller in the mirror. She did not look back at it. She looked at the road ahead, which was straight and lit and led, for now, toward the quarters she had occupied for 3 years. And after that, after the arrangements, After the transition, after 0500 Monday and 0600 Tuesday, and the careful handoff of responsibilities she had built in a quiet place led toward something else. Sector 9. The ground she knew, the south grid she had moved through in the dark years ago, with 8 people depending on the quality of her decisions and the hold of her dressings, and the specific earned knowledge of what to do when the situation had exceeded its parameters and the extraction route was gone, and the only option remaining was to move forward through terrain that nobody had cleared and trust what you knew. She trusted what she knew. The Fort Bragg running track at midnight was empty except for the wind that came down from the northwest and the particular silence of a military base in its quiet hours. Not absent of sound, but organized differently, the machinery of the place running at reduced capacity, the human element temporarily withdrawn. In the morning, at 0500, a woman named Daisy Chen would arrive at the north end of the track with a water bottle and the specific quality of intention that had been in her voice when she said, "I want to train for real." And she would wait. And she would wonder if the person she was waiting for would appear. The person she was waiting for would appear. That was simply the kind of person Ivy Calloway was. The kind who appears when she has said she will appear, who does the work when she has said she will do the work, who carries the weight without announcing it and sets it down only when the setting down serves something larger than the carrying. And in 60 days, or give or take 60 days, Building 7 would have a new nurse in the rotation, someone who would move through the wards with the efficient competence of a person trained well, who would handle the instruments with precision and the patients with care, and who might, in the quiet hours, wonder about the stethoscope that had been left on the hook in the locker room and the woman who had left it there, and where she had gone. The answer was South Grid, Sector 9, Kandahar Province, doing her job the way she had always done her job. If Ivy's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It just shows up. Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories like this one. Our next video drops this week. And remember, the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous one. The flagpoles stood in the midnight quiet. The base breathed its reduced breath. The locker room on the east side of Building 7 held its torn uniform and its stethoscope and the accumulated silence of a space that had been vacated with intention. Somewhere on the North Highway out of Fort Bragg, a vehicle moved through the dark. And in the inside pocket of a bag on the passenger seat, folded against the lining, a letter carried a single line in compressed official print. "Whatever you decide, what you did in August of 19 has been in my thoughts for 4 years." The vehicle moved. The road was straight. Service doesn't seek recognition. It just shows up.